Welcome to my scientifically informed insider look at mental health topics. If you find this video to be interesting or helpful, please like it and subscribe to my channel.
Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today's question asks, what was passive-aggressive personality disorder? And I've also had some other questions about this same construct, like what is passive-aggressive personality? And some want to know kind of what the history was behind the personality disorder and why we no longer have it here in the DSM today. So the term passive-aggressive was first used, clinically speaking, during World War II, and it was used to describe soldiers who refused to comply with the orders of officers. But the construct of passive-aggressive actually existed before that, and it was really central to some of the clinical theory that we saw from that time period. Passive-aggressive behavior has been shown to undermine successful treatment. So if somebody has another disorder, like a major mood disorder, like depression, passive-aggressive behavior can get in the way of that disorder being treated. So the construct is important, but of course the personality disorder is no longer in the DSM. And I'm going to explain that history, and then I'm going to explain one of the models of passive-aggressive behavior that I think is particularly useful in terms of understanding how it works. So to understand passive-aggressive personality disorder, PAPD, we have to go back to the very first diagnostic and statistical manual, the DSM, that was released in 1952. In that edition of the DSM, we saw that passive-aggressive personality disorder was really conceptualized as having three types. Passive-dependent, which was somebody who is helpless, indecisive, and clingy. This eventually became dependent personality disorder, which is currently in the DSM. It's a cluster C personality disorder. The next type was the passive-aggressive type, which was pouty, stubborn, inefficient, and prone to procrastination and obstruction. And we also saw an aggressive type. And here we saw behaviors like being irritable, destructive, and resentful. Now, this aggressive type was thought to still have a dependency factor to it. So this is what differentiated the aggressive type from antisocial personality. Now, the features of the passive-aggressive type and the aggressive type were merged together in DSM-2, which came out in 1968. And here we saw that PAPD symptoms included obstructionism, pouting, procrastination, intentional inefficiency, and stubbornness. And each of these were thought to reflect hostility that the individual was unable to express openly. So that's how the pathology was conceptualized for PAPD in 1968. Now moving to the DSM-3, which came out in 1980. And here's where things really started to change for this particular personality disorder. We see that in 1980, the work group members, so these are the people that decide if a disorder is to stay or go, we see that they were really kind of having difficulty with this disorder. It was controversial at that time, although technically, of course, it was retained in 1980 in DSM-3. But of course, there still were a lot of criticisms. The passive-aggressive symptoms reflected a specific behavioral response that was to particular situations, rather than a broad personality syndrome, which is how the other personality disorders were conceptualized. So again, it was retained, but clinicians could only diagnose PAPD if a client did not meet the criteria for any other personality disorder. So really, in DSM-3, things weren't looking too good for PAPD. Now, interestingly, with DSM-3R, which came out in 1987, the criteria for PAPD were expanded to include more negative emotional features like sulking, irritability, and argumentativeness. And in addition to the changes here with the irritability, we also saw that the exclusion criterion was dropped. So clinicians now could diagnose PAPD even if the criteria for another personality disorder were met. So in 1987, it looked like maybe passive-aggressive personality disorder was making a bit of a comeback, but it was short-lived. In the DSM-4, which came out in 1994, the diagnostic criteria were expanded even more. The disorder was renamed negativistic personality disorder, and it was also put in the appendix of that version of the DSM. So it was labeled for further study. And this was really the end of passive-aggressive personality disorder. It really ended in 1994 for all intents and purposes. So we see the passive-aggressive personality disorder had kind of a shaky run, started off strong in the original DSM, and then by DSM-4, it was essentially gone. So what happened here? We see that passive-aggressive personality is a real thing, so why couldn't the disorder stay in the DSM? Well, there were a number of problems. The disorder had not received a lot of acceptance in clinical literature, so people that were researching the disorder really weren't satisfied with it. The definition was too narrow and behavioral. Passive-aggressive was too situational, did not appear to reflect a syndrome. The definition of PAPD seemed to involve motivation during a time when personality disorder criteria were really just descriptive. So in order to diagnose PAPD, a clinical inference was required, and again, that just wasn't popular during this time for personality disorders. Also, this disorder overlapped quite a bit with other personality disorders. So we see a number of problems that really seem to cause the demise of this particular personality disorder. Another possible cause for the demise of PAPD was that negativistic part was added, and that really made it so the personality disorder did not hold together as well. So if they had kind of left the negativistic pieces away from PAPD, it may still be around today. So again, there are a lot of factors that go into this, including the personalities of the people trying to decide whether to keep a personality disorder or not. So we see a lot of different opinions in different directions, and PAPD just didn't make it past really DSM-3R, again being moved to the appendix in DSM-4. This all, of course, is fairly interesting because passive-aggressive behavior is narrow and behavioral, but it's understood in clinical theory to be driven by relatively stable personality dynamics. So it does kind of seem like a good candidate for being a personality disorder, and there are still a number of experts that believe it still really is a personality disorder, even though it's not technically a diagnosis, that it still exists in the form that it was described years ago. So even though the personality disorder is gone, we know that there are many consequences to having passive-aggressive personality. I mentioned before it's linked to poor response of treatment for other disorders. We know that it seems to be related to issues around autonomy. We see that it's associated with high levels of neuroticism, manipulativeness, aggression, and lower levels of agreeableness and conscientiousness. So passive-aggressive personality still exists. It's not recognized as a disorder, but we can still study it and kind of see how the symptoms are manifested. And we can also see that it appears to overlap a lot with other personality disorders. So as we kind of study passive-aggressive personality, you can see how, again, it's in the population, we can observe it, but it does seem to have this problem of running into the territory of other personality disorders. So this brings me to looking at 5 different factors that appear to be related to passive-aggressive behavior, and of course they're also related to each other in a specific way, which I'll talk about when I'm finished describing these 5 factors. So these 5 factors related to passive-aggressive behavior include rigidity, resentment, resistance, reactance, and reversed reinforcement. So they all begin with the letter R. So the first factor, rigidity, we see here someone who's inflexible, maladaptive, stubborn, authoritative, and dogmatic. So they believe that things should be done in a certain way. So again, we know this exists. We know that some people are rigid, but of course this has a lot of overlap with obsessive-compulsive personality disorder, which of course is a cluster C personality disorder. Moving to resentment, we see anger, irritability, being cynical, skeptical, low on trust, also having jealousy, paranoia, and having shame over expressing anger and having a lot of anger churned inward. So again, we know all these characteristics exist, we know resentment exists, but we can see a lot of overlap. We see with the skeptical, low on trust, and paranoid characteristics, those relate to paranoid personality disorder. We see the anger and irritability, and to some extent being cynical, seem to have a relation to antisocial personality disorder. And of course, jealousy has an association with narcissistic personality disorder. So a number of personality disorders there seem to be in that same area of resentment, as it's defined here, as it's related to passive-aggressive behavior. The next factor is resistance. And here we see low self-esteem. The theory is that somebody is too weak to directly express dissatisfaction. So with this resistance piece, people reject useful advice and they're inactive, so they just refuse to do any work or engage in activity, and they have oppositional attitudes toward authority, which of course we see with antisocial personality disorder. Although it's not specifically listed as a characteristic of that disorder, we know it's an associated characteristic. So moving to reactance. Here we see procrastination, and really reactance occurs because somebody believes that one of their behavioral options is being threatened. So the range of options they have available is being restricted, and this causes this reactance. So, for example, somebody could agree to cooperate to help you on a project and then back out at the last moment. This is really classic reactance as it relates to passive-aggressive behavior. What this does, other than being frustrated for the other person, is it restores an individual's perceived freedom of choice. So their sense of control is retained. So by offering to be helpful, by offering to cooperate with people, and then pulling back at the last second, they're holding on to control. So this leads me to the last factor, which is reversed reinforcement. So what's happening here is that normally when problems occur, this causes a feeling of distress. So for people who aren't passive-aggressive, something goes wrong, they feel distressed. But with reversed reinforcement, when something goes wrong, this actually leads to feelings of power and gratification. So if somebody's passive-aggressive, failure is kind of a good thing emotionally, in a sense. So for example, somebody may agree to do something that they know they're probably not going to enjoy. Like you may want somebody to go to a restaurant with you and try some different food. So they agree to do that. It turns out badly, and then they resent it. And they may feel some sort of gratification from this resentment. So in a sense, with reversed reinforcement and passive-aggressive behavior, somebody who has this has no way of losing. They predict a bad outcome, they cause that bad outcome or contribute to it, and then they can say they were right all along. So it doesn't really leave a way to reach negative emotions. So in a sense, it may be kind of protective, like what we see with narcissistic personality disorder. But either way, that's the last factor here, reversed reinforcement. So how do all these factors relate to one another? Well, we see that rigidity and resentment seem to lay the attitudinal and emotional foundation for resistance and reactance. And resistance and reactance appear to lead to reversed reinforcement. Now, this isn't a perfect model, but I think it explains passive-aggressive behavior in a fairly clever way, and a way that I can relate to my clinical experience in dealing with many people who have had passive-aggressive behavior. These factors appear to make sense in light of what I've heard described by many people who have passive-aggressive behavior. So it's important to realize here that even though passive-aggressive personality disorder is gone, somebody can still receive treatment for passive-aggressive behavior, and of course you can still receive treatment if you've interacted with somebody who has that behavior and it's frustrating you or causing other symptoms in you. So just because something isn't an official personality disorder or a mental disorder of some type doesn't mean it can't be the focus of clinical treatment. So passive-aggressive behavior is real, even though the personality disorder is not really with us anymore. And if we see passive-aggressive behavior from a clinical perspective, like you're working with somebody and you're a clinician, you may still be able to diagnose them with one or more of the other personality disorders, again, because there's a lot of overlap between the construct of passive-aggressive behavior and the personality disorders that are currently available in the DSM. So I know whenever I talk about passive-aggressive behavior and personality disorders, there are going to be a lot of different opinions. If you agree or disagree with me on one of the points I made here in this video or have other opinions, please put those in the comments. As always, I hope you found this description of passive-aggressive personality disorder to be interesting. Thanks for watching.